Hello and welcome everyone. In this podcast and the next podcast, we're going to talk about macromolecules. As we begin this discussion of macromolecules, it'll be important for us to first talk about functional groups. And in that discussion, we're going to want to talk about hydrocarbons and how they can form bonds and how they're important in establishing certain functions to certain molecules. We'll then want to talk about how we go from small organic molecules to macromolecules. We'll then spend quite a bit of time talking about the four major macromolecules: carbohydrates, proteins. When I say carbohydrates, I mean more complex sugars, not just a simple monosaccharide. Proteins, which are made up of amino acids, nucleic acids, made up of nucleotides, and then lipids, which aren't really a classic polymer like these three here that are made up of various kinds of monomers. They're a little different than that. They're a macromolecule, but they're not a polymer, as I said, made up of smaller subunits. We'll then end with a discussion on the importance of non-covalent interactions. But let's start by our discussion of functional groups. As we open up the discussion of functional groups, I want to spend a little time talking about hydrocarbons. Not a lot of time, just enough. Because hydrocarbons are going to make up the backbone of these functional groups. And when we think about hydrocarbons, we can define them by their length. That is, how many carbons in a row are there? And carbons will be surrounded by hydrogens, like so. At least in this example. They could certainly be surrounded by other elements too, but we're talking about hydrocarbon chains, so I'm going to put hydrogens here. We can also think of hydrocarbons as branching. So I'm going to draw some carbons here, and maybe we don't have hydrogens off of all of these. Maybe we have another carbon coming off of it, like I'll show here, where it branches. It doesn't form a straight line, it branches. And a lot of hydrocarbons within biomolecules will have these branching features to them. We can also think of hydrogen carbons as being defined by double bonds. And to draw that, I'm going to draw a series of carbons. But on this one, I'm going to put a double bond. And so these will still have hydrogens around them, like so. Except for these two middle carbons where there's that double bond at, they will only have one hydrogen attached to them. And lastly, I'm going to talk about rings. Hydrocarbons, in addition to being defined by length, branching, and double bonds, they can be defined by their ability to form a ring instead of a straight line. And even within these rings, you could still have branching and double bonds. And the sizes of the rings can vary too. I just drew one with 6 carbons. And at these points here, whenever you see a ring like this, you assume there's a carbon at each point with hydrogens attached. So this last one here is ring. These different hydrocarbons are seen in various macromolecules. Before we move to macromolecules, I want to now list 7 functional groups. These functional groups provide function, as the name implies, to the molecules they're attached to. And if you've had organic chemistry, this won't be anything new to you. So hydroxyl is the first one. And this is where you have an O and an H attached to perhaps a carbon. The next one, carbonyl. A carbonyl molecule or functional group will look like so. It will have a carbon with an oxygen atom attached to it, and then a carbon. And the carbons, of course, will still have these hydrogens. So that's a carbonyl. So the thing that really defines the carbonyl here is this CO. Just like up here, the OH define the hydroxyl. The next one is carboxyl. Now that is similar to the carbonyl with a slight difference. So you'll still have your carbon here. You'll have your carbon here with the double bond oxygen. And then over here, instead of having another carbon, you'll have an OH. So the carboxyl group is defined by that structure there. Next is an amino functional group. Amino functional group will look like so. We'll have a nitrogen with a hydrogen and a second hydrogen. And it can be attached to a carbon like that. We could also have another hydrogen attached to this as well. The next one, sulfhydroxyl group. And as the name implies, it's going to have a sulfur group on it. So it is defined by this SH. The next one, phosphate. And it's going to be defined having this phosphorus group on it, like so. So it is defined by having a phosphorus on it. And then the last one here is methyl, and it will look like such. A carbon with 3 hydrogen atoms on it. Alright, now let's move on to macromolecules. We're going to start by talking about small organic molecules. The first are sugars. We could also call these monosaccharides. Amino acids will be our second one. Our third will be nucleotides. Our fourth will be fatty acids. Sometimes we will call these small organic molecules subunits, and sometimes we'll call them monomers. And we'll call them monomers sometimes because these are the building blocks. Repeating units of these sugars, amino acids, and nucleotides will form larger polymers, which are the macromolecules. Fatty acids are a little different. I'll talk about the exception when we get to them. But through a reaction of each of these, we form the macromolecules. These are large organic molecules. And for the first three, at least, we could call them polymers. Sugars, under a reaction, can form large polymers called polysaccharides. Amino acids, through a reaction with each other, can form proteins. Nucleotides, they form the macromolecule nucleic acid. And fatty acids can form fats and lipids. The reaction that forms these we call condensation reactions. And these condensation reactions occur in a manner where water is lost. So going from small organic molecule, the subunits here, into these larger macromolecules, a water molecule is lost. And remember, we said these were called condensation reactions. Sometimes we might call these also dehydration reactions. Now the reverse is also true. we can go from these larger macromolecules, and they can be broken down into these smaller monomers, sugars, amino acids, nucleotides, and fatty acids. And in doing so, water is required for these reactions. And these, on the green arrow, that require water to break down the larger macromolecules, these reactions are called hydrolysis reactions because they break down water in the process. I also want to just quickly state why I said that fatty acids were not true monomers of fats or lipids, and that's because fats and lipids, as well as cholesterol, that would also form over here, they are not repeating units of fatty acids. So fats and lipids are not, by definition, a polymer of fatty acid. Now what I'd like to do is spend just a little bit more time talking about each of these 4 macromolecules. Okay, let's end here with a quick summary of this first podcast on macromolecules. In this podcast, we talked about carbon. We opened with carbon. And more specifically, we talked about how hydrocarbons can be characterized. Remember, we talked about how they can be characterized as linear formations, the presence or absence of double bonds, whether or not they're branched, and if they formed rings. So we talked about those characters. We then spent a little time talking about functional groups, and we only talked about 7 functional groups. So make sure you know those functional groups. You should be able to draw them, and you should be able to identify them if I provide a structure that has one or maybe multiple functional groups, and you should be able to pull out which functional groups I'm talking about. We then talked about small organic molecules. Sometimes I mentioned we call those subunits or monomers, and how these small organic molecules then are used to build these large organic molecules, which we typically will call macromolecules. In the next podcast, we're going to spend more time talking about these macromolecules and nonpolar interactions, and how nonpolar interactions are really important in forming these macromolecules. Alright, if you have any questions at all, please make sure you come see me. If not, I'll see you in class. Bye.